Aftermath. U.S. Dakota War of 1862, Part 2. Lesson Objective. I can identify the effects of the war for the Dakota and settlers after the war ended. Lincoln's Decision. Here you see Lincoln's order of December 6, 1862, a 3-page document authorizing the execution of 38 Dakota. Under U.S. law, none of those men could be executed or killed without the approval of President Abraham Lincoln. At the urging of Minnesota missionary Henry Whipple, Lincoln's staff reviewed the cases. The more Lincoln learned, the more troubled he felt. After reviewing the execution cases along with his staff, he found problems with the way the commission had conducted the trials and was worried that the 303 convictions were motivated by revenge. But he was conflicted. He realized that angry Minnesotans might take revenge against the Dakota if he ordered new trials or released the condemned men. In November, he met with Whipple, who described the terrible conditions on the reservations prior to the war and asked the president to show mercy. After reviewing the cases along with his staff, Lincoln identified only 2 whose executions he approved. Realizing that executing just 2 of the 303 would cause outrage, Lincoln added to the execution order any of those who were guilty of killing civilians. Dakota soldiers who fought in battles against U.S. soldiers were spared. By doing so, Lincoln distinguished those who had participated in the killing of civilians from those who had fought in battles. On December 6, 1862, Lincoln's decision was communicated via telegram. 39 of the 303 prisoners originally sentenced would be executed. All those who had been convicted of murder or participation in the killing of civilians. 1 Dakota man was spared at the last minute because doubt was cast on the reliability of the testimony of 2 young boys who had convicted him. Question 1. If you were in President Lincoln's position, what would you have decided? Give at least 2 reasons. December 26, 1862. Once President Lincoln's telegram was received, the condemned prisoners were separated. Relatives were allowed to visit and say goodbye. At 10:00 a.m. on December 26th, 38 Dakota prisoners were led to a scaffold specially constructed for this execution. An estimated 4,000 spectators crammed the streets of Mankato and surrounding land. Colonel Stephen Miller was charged with keeping the peace in the days leading up to the hanging. As the men took their assigned places on the scaffold, they sang a Dakota song. White coverings were put over their faces. A drumbeat signaled the start of the execution. The men grasped each other's hands, and with a single blow from an axe, the rope that held the platform was cut. Captain William Dooley, who had lost several family members in the attack on Lake Chetek, cut the rope. After a half hour, the men's bodies were cut down and hauled to a shallow mass grave on a sandbar between Mankato's Main Street and the Minnesota River. By morning, most of the bodies had been dug up without permission and taken by doctors for use as medical cadavers. A cadaver is a dead human body that may be used by physicians and other scientists to study anatomy, identify disease sites, determine causes of death, and provide tissue to repair a defect in a living human being. Following the mass execution on December 26th, it was discovered that 2 men had been mistakenly hanged. The remaining prisoners were moved to Camp McClellan, a military prison in Iowa, in May of 1863, where they remained until they were released in 1866, 3 years later. Question number 2. How did the convicted Dakota experience injustice? Give at least 2 examples. Internment. About 1,700 Dakota spent the winter of 1862 and 1863 at this internment camp below Fort Snelling.
Fort Snelling. It's a place that should be remembered, but there is immense sadness there.
In 1819, the U.S. Army built a fort at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, a place that is the sacred center of the Dakota homeland. Fort Snelling would go on to become a site of major significance in U.S. and state history. But in the turbulent wake of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, the fort would also become, for more than 1,700 Dakota people, a place of disease, brutality, and death. In early November 1862, U.S. soldiers gathered these survivors of the conflict, mostly women, children, and elders who had surrendered, and forced them to march from the Lower Sioux Agency to Fort Snelling, a distance of more than 100 miles. Unlike the more than 300 captured Dakota warriors, most of these survivors had not been sentenced to death or prison, but they were to be held at an internment camp, surrounded by a high stockade and located on flat land below the fort. Here they would spend a harsh winter, awaiting their fate.
That confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota River is a really important site to Dakota people because it marks another geographic and ancient sacred place. And then on top of that, it's where the concentration camp was and where people were imprisoned. So it has a bittersweet connotation there. It's a place of rebirth and birth, but it's also a place of great tragedy.
Armed soldiers and angry white settlers harassed and brutalized the Dakota interned at the site. Visiting missionaries worked to convert the Dakota to Christianity. Estimates of deaths in the camp that winter range from 100 to 300, mostly due to outbreaks of measles and other diseases.
And there must have been a lot of them that died there. And what happened to them? Expendable, I guess.
Question number 3. How did the interned Dakota experience injustice? Give at least 2 examples. Exile. After the war, the Dakota were exiled from Minnesota. Exile definition: to force to leave one's country or homeland. Acts of Congress in February and March 1863 abrogated or revoked or canceled all treaties between the U.S. government and the Dakota. One way the government attempted to assist settlers who had suffered damage and injury was to offer them financial reimbursement or payments using annuity money from the revoked Dakota treaties. Congress passed a law on February 16, 1863, assigning $200,000 for the payment of settlers' claims. It assigned over $1 million the next year. Over the course of several years, about 2,600 claims were filed, and a commission was set up to assess these claims and make payments for those deemed valid. In March of 1863, Congress declared that the Dakota reservation land in Minnesota was to be sold, and the Dakota exiled to new reservations outside the boundaries of any existing state. The Crow Creek Reservation was in Dakota Territory, land that would later become North and South Dakota, and the Santee Reservation was in Nebraska Territory. By early 1863, the U.S. government had canceled all treaties they had signed with the Dakota and Minnesota. The reservation and the annuities were gone. The Dakota would be forced to leave the state. In May of 1863, those who had survived the winter in the internment camp at Fort Snelling were exiled. Steamboats, barges, and trains carried more than 1,500 Dakota on rivers and over land to a reservation at Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota. Take a minute to look closely at the map. It was a desolate place, and food was scarce. Desolate means without the things that are necessary or desirable for life. Scarce means difficult to find. The government sent food, but it was never enough and almost always came late. Hundreds of Dakota, nearly 200, mostly children, died from hunger and disease. The missionary, John P. Williamson, who had worked with the Dakota and Minnesota, went to visit. He was appalled by the conditions there. He called Crow Creek a desert and a place that was totally unfit for the habitation of any human being. In 1866, the government finally let the exiled Dakota move to a new reservation in Nebraska. The land was better there than it had been in South Dakota, but it was nothing like home. It was not Minnesota. Question number 4. How did the exiled Dakota experience injustice? Give at least 2 examples. Changed landscape. In the summer of 1863, hardly anyone lived in southwestern Minnesota. Nearly all the settlers in the region had abandoned their homes during the war. Most of the Dakota had either fled from the state or been exiled. Only about 200 Dakota who had helped the settlers during the war were allowed to stay. As the years went by, the Dakota remained separated. Many chose to stay on reservations in Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and even Canada. Many others, however, wanted to return home to Minnesota. Within a few years, some of the Dakota who had been forced to leave their homeland returned to live alongside their relatives who had been allowed to stay in Minnesota. Beginning in the 1880s, these Dakota worked with the U.S. government to establish new communities at the old Upper and Lower Sioux agencies, at Prairie Island, and at Prior Lake. By the time they established these communities, though, the Dakota could hardly recognize the land that they had lived on for generations. It had changed forever. Tens of thousands of new settlers had moved to Minnesota, intent on farming the land in the ways of the European American. A tragedy is an event causing great suffering, destruction, and distress. Question number 5. How was the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 a tragedy for all involved? Give at least 2 examples from different perspectives.